The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as Camilla Parker Bowles stepped out of her private quarters, carrying a modest leather handbag that had seen better days. To anyone watching, she appeared to be preparing for another routine royal engagement. But Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews of the Royal Protection Unit noticed something different about the Queen Consort's demeanor that Tuesday morning. Sarah had been assigned to the Royal Security Detail for over 15 years, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people. Her colleagues often joked that she could spot trouble from a mile away. But today her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Camilla's usually confident stride seemed hesitant, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. The Queen Consort was scheduled to attend a charity event in London, a simple affair that should have required minimal security preparations. However, when Sarah reviewed the guest list earlier that morning, she discovered several names that made her pause. Among the attendees were 3 individuals who had connections to a recent investigation involving stolen historical documents from the Royal Archives. As Camilla's motorcade prepared to depart, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following standard protocol, she discreetly activated the advanced surveillance system that monitored all royal movements. The system, known only to a select few within the security apparatus, could track everything from biometric data to the contents of personal belongings through sophisticated scanning technology. The journey to London proceeded without incident, but Sarah's monitoring equipment began picking up unusual readings from Camilla's handbag. The scanners detected what appeared to be multiple layers of dense material wrapped around several small objects. More concerning was the electromagnetic signature, which suggested the presence of electronic devices that hadn't been declared through normal security channels. When the motorcade arrived at the charity venue, Sarah positioned herself strategically near the entrance. She watched as Camilla greeted the other attendees with her characteristic warmth, but the Queen Consort's eyes kept darting toward her handbag. During a brief moment when Camilla excused herself to use the restroom, Sarah noticed that she took the handbag with her, which was unusual given that royal protocol typically involved leaving personal items with security staff. The charity event proceeded smoothly on the surface, but Sarah's trained eye caught several subtle irregularities. First, she noticed that 3 of the attendees with questionable backgrounds seemed to position themselves at specific points around the room, creating what appeared to be a triangular formation with Camilla at the center. Second, during the formal presentation, Camilla's handbag was placed on a table in a way that its opening faced toward one of these individuals. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah's suspicions deepened when she observed a brief exchange between Camilla and a woman named Victoria Sterling, who was officially listed as a representative from a historical preservation society. The conversation appeared casual to most observers, but Sarah noticed that Victoria's eyes remained fixed on Camilla's handbag throughout their discussion. More troubling was the subtle hand gesture Victoria made toward 2 other individuals across the room. The breakthrough came when Sarah's surveillance equipment detected a brief radio transmission originating from within Camilla's handbag. The signal was encrypted and lasted only seconds, but it was clearly a form of communication that bypassed all official royal security protocols. Sarah realized that whatever was hidden in that handbag was not just contraband, but potentially part of a larger conspiracy. As the charity event neared its conclusion, Sarah faced a dilemma that tested every aspect of her training and loyalty. On one hand, Camilla was the Queen Consort, a person whose privacy and dignity were paramount to the royal institution. On the other hand, Sarah's duty was to protect the crown from all threats, both external and internal. The evidence strongly suggested that Camilla was either being manipulated or was willingly participating in something that could damage the monarchy. The decision became urgent when Sarah's equipment detected what appeared to be a timer mechanism within the handbag. The device wasn't counting down to an explosion in the traditional sense, but rather seemed to be coordinating with other electronic devices in the room. Sarah realized that she was potentially witnessing the setup phase of a sophisticated operation designed to compromise royal security or steal sensitive information. With minutes remaining, before the event's conclusion, Sarah made her choice. She discreetly activated the emergency protocol that would allow her to intercept any royal family member if there was an imminent threat to national security. The protocol had never been used against a member of the royal family, but Sarah's evidence suggested that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. As Camilla prepared to leave the venue, Sarah approached with a small team of plainclothes security officers. Her heart pounded as she realized that the next few minutes would either vindicate her suspicions or end her career in disgrace. The queen consort looked surprised when Sarah requested a private word, but she agreed with the grace that had become her trademark since joining the royal family. In a quiet corner of the venue, Sarah explained that routine security protocols required a brief inspection of personal items before departure. Camilla's reaction was telling. Instead of the indignant response one might expect from a senior royal, she appeared nervous and began making excuses about why the handbag couldn't be opened at that moment. Her behavior confirmed Sarah's worst fears about what might be hidden inside. The tension in the room became palpable as other attendees began to notice the unusual interaction between the queen consort and the security team. Victoria Sterling and her associates seemed particularly agitated, confirming Sarah's suspicions about their involvement in whatever conspiracy was unfolding. The charity event that had begun as a routine royal engagement was rapidly transforming into something that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Sarah knew that the contents of Camilla's handbag held the key to understanding a plot that could have far-reaching consequences for the royal family and potentially the nation itself. As she prepared to make her formal request to examine the bag, she couldn't help but wonder how deep this conspiracy ran and whether other members of the royal family might also be compromised. The silence stretched between Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews and Queen Consort Camilla, like a taut wire ready to snap. Around them, the charity event continued with polite conversation and clinking teacups, but Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on this moment. Never before had a member of the Royal Protection Unit been forced to directly confront a senior royal about potential security violations. Camilla's hands trembled, slightly, as she clutched her leather handbag closer to her chest. The woman who had faced decades of public scrutiny and media storms now seemed vulnerable in a way that Sarah had never witnessed. Her eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Sarah's face, as if calculating whether she could simply walk away from this confrontation. "Your Majesty," Sarah said quietly, using her most respectful tone while maintaining her professional authority, "I need you to understand that this isn't personal. We've detected some irregularities that require immediate attention for everyone's safety." She gestured subtly toward her surveillance equipment, which continued to register concerning signals from within the handbag. Camilla's response surprised everyone present. Instead of anger or indignation, tears began to form in her eyes. "You don't understand what you're asking of me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the charity event. "There are complications that go far beyond what you might imagine." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This wasn't the reaction of someone caught in a simple security breach. Camilla's words suggested something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The queen consort's obvious distress indicated that she might be as much a victim as a perpetrator in whatever conspiracy was unfolding. Across the room, Victoria Sterling had positioned herself near one of the large windows, apparently engaged in casual conversation with other guests. However, Sarah's trained eye caught the woman's frequent glances toward their corner and the way she seemed to be coordinating with two other individuals through subtle gestures. The triangular formation Sarah had noticed earlier was still intact, creating what appeared to be a surveillance network focused on Camilla. "Ma'am," Sarah continued gently but firmly, "whatever situation you're facing, we can help. But first I need to understand what we're dealing with. The safety protocols exist to protect everyone, including you." She paused, then added with genuine concern, "Are you in some kind of trouble?" The question seemed to break something inside Camilla. She looked around the room with obvious fear, her gaze lingering on Victoria Sterling and her associates. "They said no one would get hurt," she whispered, so quietly that Sarah had to lean closer to hear. "They promised it would just be information, nothing that would damage the crown or put anyone at risk." Sarah's blood ran cold. The queen consort's words confirmed her worst fears about a conspiracy involving the theft or compromise of sensitive royal information. More troubling was Camilla's obvious belief that she was protecting others by participating in whatever scheme was unfolding. The emotional manipulation tactics suggested the involvement of sophisticated operators, possibly with intelligence backgrounds. Who made these promises? Sarah asked while simultaneously signaling her team to begin discreet surveillance of the suspected conspirators. And what kind of information are we talking about? Camilla's hands shook as she began to open her handbag. It started 3 months ago, she began, her voice heavy with guilt and fear. I received a letter at Clarence's house delivered through what appeared to be official channels. It contained photographs, compromising photographs from years ago before I married Charles. Sarah's mind raced as she processed this revelation. Blackmail against a senior royal represented a threat to national security, but it also explained Camilla's cooperation with what was clearly a criminal enterprise. The Queen Consort wasn't a willing conspirator, but rather a victim being coerced into betraying her position and family. The letter said that these photographs would be released to the media unless I cooperated with certain requests, Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as she unburdened herself of the secret that had been tormenting her for months. At first, they only wanted information about Charles's schedule and private meetings, nothing that seemed particularly sensitive or dangerous. As Camilla spoke, Sarah's surveillance equipment continued to monitor the electronic devices within the handbag. The timer mechanism she had detected earlier appeared to be synchronized with similar devices carried by Victoria Sterling and her associates. Sarah realized they were witnessing the final phase of what was likely a complex intelligence-gathering operation. But then the requests became more specific, Camilla continued, now fully committed to her confession. They wanted copies of documents from Charles's private study, photographs of correspondence, even recordings of private conversations. I realized that I was being used to spy on my own husband and family. The magnitude of the security breach began to dawn on Sarah. If Camilla had been providing information and materials to unknown parties for 3 months, the damage to royal security and privacy could be extensive. More immediately concerning was the electronic equipment in the handbag, which suggested that today's charity event was meant to be some kind of culmination of the intelligence-gathering operation. Sarah carefully opened the handbag under Camilla's trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in silk scarves to muffle any electronic signatures, were several small devices that looked like sophisticated recording and transmission equipment. There were also USB drives, what appeared to be copied documents, and a smartphone that wasn't registered through royal security channels. They gave me these devices last week, Camilla explained, her relief at finally sharing her burden evident in her voice. They said I needed to activate them during today's event and then leave the handbag in a specific location where it could be retrieved later. They promised this would be the end of it, that I would never hear from them again. Sarah examined the devices more closely, recognizing military-grade surveillance equipment that would have cost tens of thousands of pounds and required specialized knowledge to operate. This wasn't the work of ordinary blackmailers or petty criminals, but rather suggested the involvement of state-level actors or sophisticated criminal organizations with access to advanced technology. The emotional toll on Camilla was evident as she watched Sarah catalog the contents of her handbag. I know I've made terrible mistakes, she said, tears flowing freely now. I was so afraid of the scandal, of what it would do to Charles and the monarchy. I thought I could handle it quietly, that no one else would have to be involved. Around them, the charity event continued, but Sarah could see that Victoria Sterling and her associates were becoming agitated by the extended conversation between the Queen Consort and the security team. One of the men had moved closer to their position, while another seemed to be speaking quietly into a concealed communication device. Sarah realized that the conspiracy was about to enter a new and potentially dangerous phase. The blackmailers had clearly expected Camilla to complete her mission without interference, and the presence of the security team represented a significant threat to their operation. The question now was whether they would simply abort their plan or escalate to more aggressive tactics to protect their investment. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews felt the situation shifting into dangerous territory as she noticed Victoria Sterling making increasingly aggressive gestures toward her associates. The woman's facade of casual socializing was cracking, replaced by the focused intensity of someone whose carefully planned operation was falling apart. Sarah knew from experience that desperate criminals often made their most dangerous decisions when cornered. "We need to move you to a secure location immediately," Sarah told Camilla, while discreetly signaling her team to prepare for potential hostile action. The Queen Consort's confession had provided crucial intelligence, but it had also placed everyone in the room at risk. If the blackmailers were willing to coerce a senior royal, they wouldn't hesitate to use violence to protect their operation. Camilla nodded, but her fear was evident as she glanced around the room. "There's something else you need to know," she whispered urgently. They didn't just want information about Charles. They were particularly interested in his upcoming meetings with foreign dignitaries and his correspondence with government officials. I think they were trying to gather intelligence about state matters, not just personal information. This revelation elevated the situation from blackmail to potential espionage against the British government. Sarah's mind raced through the implications as she realized they were dealing with foreign intelligence operatives who had successfully penetrated the highest levels of the royal family. The 3 months of information gathering could have compromised national security in ways that wouldn't be discovered for years. Across the room, one of Victoria's associates had begun moving toward the exit, while another seemed to be photographing the guests with a concealed camera. Sarah recognized the behavior of intelligence operatives preparing to evacuate while gathering final pieces of information. The fact that they weren't immediately fleeing suggested they still hoped to salvage something from their compromised operation. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and follow my lead," Sarah instructed Camilla, while her surveillance equipment continued to monitor the electronic devices in the handbag. The timer mechanisms were still active, counting down to what Sarah feared might be a data transmission or worse. "We're going to walk toward the main exit, but we may need to change direction quickly if the situation deteriorates." As they began to move, Victoria Sterling suddenly abandoned her pretense of casual conversation and began walking directly toward them. Her expression had transformed from friendly socialite to something much more threatening. Sarah could see the outline of what appeared to be a weapon concealed beneath the woman's elegant jacket, confirming her worst fears about the level of danger they were facing. "Your Majesty," Victoria called out in a voice that carried across the room, causing other guests to turn and look. "I believe you've forgotten something important." Her words were clearly intended as some kind of signal or threat, and Sarah noticed that the other 2 associates had also begun moving toward their position. Sarah made a split-second decision that would determine whether this situation ended peacefully or violently. She activated the emergency alert system that would immediately summon armed backup and notify Scotland Yard of a potential terrorist incident. The response would be massive and immediate, but it would also inevitably expose the blackmail plot and Camilla's involvement to public scrutiny. "Victoria Sterling," Sarah called out, using her authority voice that had been trained to carry in crisis situations. "You and your associates need to remain where you are. This venue is now under the protection of the Royal Security Service, and any attempt to leave will be considered a hostile act." The announcement had an immediate effect on the charity event. Guests began looking around nervously, some moving toward exits while others clustered together in confusion. Several elderly attendees seemed genuinely frightened by the sudden tension, while others appeared to be calculating whether they were witnessing a genuine security threat or some kind of misunderstanding. Victoria's response confirmed Sarah's assessment of the situation. Instead of showing surprise or confusion at being named as a security threat, the woman smiled coldly and continued her advance toward Camilla. "Detective Inspector Matthews," she said, somehow knowing Sarah's name and rank despite never having been introduced. "You're interfering with matters that are far beyond your understanding or authority." The fact that Victoria knew Sarah's identity proved that the conspiracy had intelligence capabilities that extended far beyond simple blackmail. They had been monitoring royal security operations and had likely identified key personnel as potential obstacles to their mission. Sarah realized that she and her team might have been targeted for surveillance or worse. Camilla gripped Sarah's arm tightly as Victoria approached. "She's the one," the Queen Consort whispered frantically. "She's the one who's been giving me the instructions and collecting the information. But she's not working alone. There are others, people in positions of trust who've been helping her." This revelation about additional conspirators within trusted circles sent chills down Sarah's spine. If Victoria Sterling had accomplices among royal staff, government officials, or security personnel, then the breach could be far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The possibility of insider threats made every aspect of royal security potentially compromised. The electronic devices in Camilla's handbag suddenly began, emitting a high-pitched whine that was barely audible but detectable by Sarah's sensitive equipment. The timer mechanisms had reached some kind of activation point, suggesting that whatever final phase of the operation was planned was about to commence. Sarah realized they might have only minutes or even seconds before something catastrophic occurred. "Everyone needs to evacuate this building immediately," Sarah announced to the room, while her team began coordinating with local authorities, who were responding to the emergency alert. "This is not a drill. Please move toward the nearest exits in an orderly fashion." Victoria Sterling's mask finally fell away completely as chaos began to engulf the charity event. "You have no idea what you've done," she snarled at Sarah while reaching inside her jacket for what was clearly a weapon. Months of careful planning, compromised by an overzealous security guard who doesn't understand the bigger picture. The insult was clearly intended to provoke Sarah into making a mistake, but her training had prepared her for exactly this kind of psychological manipulation. Instead of responding emotionally, she continued her professional assessment of the threat while positioning herself between Victoria and Camilla. Her backup would arrive within minutes, but the immediate danger required decisive action. "The bigger picture," Sarah replied calmly, "is that you've committed espionage against the crown and threatened a member of the royal family. Whatever your motivations or objectives, this ends now." As sirens began to wail in the distance, signaling the approach of armed response units, Victoria Sterling made her final desperate play. She lunged toward Camilla with what appeared to be some kind of electronic device, possibly intended to complete the data transfer that had been the ultimate goal of the 3-month operation. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive, tackling the woman before she could reach the queen consort. The struggle that followed would later be described in official reports as brief but intense. Victoria Sterling proved to be far more physically capable than her elegant appearance had suggested, confirming Sarah's suspicions about her professional training. However, Sarah's years of experience in royal protection had prepared her for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat situation. As they wrestled for control of the electronic device, Sarah could hear Camilla calling for help and the sound of running footsteps as other guests fled the building. The charity event that had begun as a routine royal engagement had transformed into a full-scale counterintelligence operation that would have consequences extending far beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. The armed response team burst through the doors of the charity venue, just as Sarah Matthews managed to subdue Victoria Sterling and secure the electronic device that had been intended for the final data transfer. The timing couldn't have been more crucial, as Sarah had discovered that the device was programmed to upload 3 months' worth of stolen royal intelligence to servers located in 3 different countries simultaneously. Victoria Sterling lay on the floor, her elegant facade completely shattered as she glared up at Sarah with undisguised hatred. "You think this changes anything?" she spat, blood trickling from her lip where she had struck the ground during their struggle. "The information we've already gathered will still find its way to those who can use it most effectively." Sarah felt a chill at the woman's words, realizing that today's charity event had never been meant to be the end of the operation, but rather, just one phase of a much larger intelligence-gathering conspiracy. The 3 months of blackmailing Camilla had likely produced enough sensitive information to compromise royal security and government operations for years to come. Across the now empty venue, Camilla stood with 2 protection officers, her face, pale but her composure gradually returning as the immediate danger passed. The queen consort watched as Victoria's 2 associates were also taken into custody, though their capture had required a brief chase through the building's service corridors when they had attempted to flee during the initial confrontation. "Inspector Matthews," the lead officer of the response team, called out, "We've secured all 3 suspects, but our preliminary scan of the building has detected additional electronic devices that weren't on any of the suspects. It appears this venue may have been under surveillance for some time." This revelation confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions about the sophistication of the operation they had uncovered. The conspiracy wasn't just about blackmailing Camilla for information, but had involved extensive preparation, including advanced surveillance of potential meeting locations. The level of resources and planning suggested state-level involvement rather than ordinary criminal activity. As the initial chaos subsided, Sarah began to piece together the full scope of what they had discovered. The electronic devices in Camilla's handbag were just the visible tip of an intelligence operation that had likely compromised royal communications, travel plans, and private correspondence for months. The damage assessment alone would take weeks or possibly months to complete. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Harrison arrived on scene within minutes of the all-clear signal, his face grim as he surveyed the aftermath of what was already being classified as a major breach of national security. Sarah had worked with Harrison for over a decade, and she could read the concern in his expression as he processed the implications of what had occurred. "Brief me on exactly what we're dealing with," Harrison said to Sarah, while crime scene technicians began processing evidence and intelligence analysts started examining the recovered electronic devices. "The preliminary reports are suggesting this goes far beyond simple blackmail." Sarah provided a concise but comprehensive overview of the 3-month operation, Camilla's coerced cooperation, and the sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been deployed. As she spoke, Harrison's expression grew increasingly troubled, particularly when she described the international server connections and the evidence of insider assistance. "We need to assume that everything the royal family has done or discussed in the past 3 months has been compromised," Harrison concluded grimly. "Travel plans, security arrangements, private conversations, correspondence with government officials, everything. This represents a complete breach of the most sensitive levels of our national security apparatus." Meanwhile, Camilla was being debriefed by senior intelligence officers who had been hastily summoned to deal with the unprecedented situation. Sarah could see the emotional toll the confession was taking on the Queen Consort, who had to relive 3 months of fear, manipulation, and betrayal, while providing detailed information about every request she had fulfilled for the blackmailers. The questioning revealed the true sophistication of the psychological manipulation that had been used against Camilla. The blackmailers had gradually escalated their requests, starting with seemingly innocuous information about social events, and gradually building to sensitive intelligence about state functions and private royal business. Each step had been designed to make the next request seem reasonable, while slowly drawing the Queen Consort deeper into their web. "They knew exactly how to approach me," Camilla explained to the debrief team, her voice heavy with guilt and exhaustion. "They understood my vulnerabilities, my fears about scandal, my desire to protect Charles and the monarchy. Every interaction was calculated to make me feel like I had no choice but to cooperate." The blackmail photographs that had been used to initially coerce Camilla proved to be sophisticated forgeries created using advanced digital manipulation techniques. The intelligence officers realized that the entire blackmail scenario had been fabricated specifically to provide leverage over the Queen Consort, suggesting months or even years of preparation and psychological profiling. As the investigation expanded, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Victoria Sterling's false identity had been carefully constructed over several years, with a complete background as a respected member of historical preservation societies. Her associates also had elaborate cover stories that had allowed them to move freely in circles connected to royal and government functions. The financial trail associated with the operation led to shell companies registered in multiple jurisdictions, making it extremely difficult to trace the ultimate source of funding or identify the true architects of the conspiracy. However, the scale of the resources involved suggested backing by a sophisticated intelligence service, rather than criminal organizations motivated purely by profit. Sarah found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant counterintelligence investigations in recent British history. The implications extended far beyond the royal family, to include potential compromises of diplomatic communications, security arrangements for visiting foreign dignitaries, and sensitive information about government policy discussions that had taken place in royal presence. The recovered electronic devices revealed the full extent of the intelligence-gathering operation. Hidden recording devices had captured conversations, high-resolution cameras had photographed documents, and sophisticated transmission equipment had been used to relay information in real time to handlers who remained unidentified, despite intensive investigation efforts. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that the operation had not been limited to Camilla alone. Intelligence analysis suggested that similar approaches may have been made to other individuals with access to sensitive information, creating The possibility that the royal blackmail scheme was just one component of a much larger espionage network operating within British society. As the day wore on, the full magnitude of the security breach became clear. The charity event that was supposed to have been the culmination of the operation would have provided the blackmailers with real-time intelligence about royal security, procedures, the identities of protection personnel, and detailed information about how the royal family responded to various types of threats. This wasn't just about gathering information, Harrison observed grimly as he reviewed the preliminary analysis reports. This was about understanding our entire security apparatus so thoroughly that future operations could be planned with near-perfect knowledge of our capabilities and limitations. The investigation was now operating under the highest levels of classification, with involvement from MI5, MI6, and international intelligence partners who were trying to determine whether similar operations might be underway in other countries. The sophisticated nature of the conspiracy suggested it was part of a broader intelligence campaign targeting Western governments and institutions. For Sarah, the professional satisfaction of successfully identifying and disrupting the operation was tempered by the realization that they had likely uncovered only a small portion of a much larger threat. The months of stolen intelligence were already in enemy hands, and the true impact of the breach might not be fully understood for years to come. 3 weeks after the charity event incident, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews found herself sitting in a windowless briefing room deep within the headquarters of MI5, surrounded by intelligence analysts, cybersecurity experts, and senior officials from multiple government agencies. The investigation had expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations, revealing a web of espionage that threatened to reshape Britain's understanding of its national security vulnerabilities. The man leading the briefing, Deputy Director James Whitmore, had spent 30 years in intelligence work, but even his experienced demeanor showed signs of strain as he outlined the findings that had emerged from the intensive investigation. "What we discovered at that charity event," he began, "represents the most sophisticated penetration of royal security in modern history. But it's also just the beginning of a much larger story." Sarah listened intently as Whitmore described how the analysis of Victoria Sterling's electronic devices had led to the discovery of an international espionage network operating across multiple continents. The stolen royal intelligence had been just one component of a coordinated campaign, targeting government officials, military leaders, and influential private citizens in dozens of countries. The psychological profiling techniques used against the Queen Consort were remarkably advanced, explained Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a specialist in counterintelligence psychology, who had been brought in to analyze the blackmail operation. The perpetrators demonstrated an understanding of human vulnerabilities that suggests either extensive academic training or practical experience with intelligence manipulation techniques. The investigation had revealed that Camilla's blackmailers had spent over 2 years studying her background, relationships, and psychological patterns before making their initial contact. They had analyzed her public statements, private charitable interests, and social connections to develop a manipulation strategy specifically tailored to her personality and circumstances. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the operation had not been limited to gathering information, but had also involved subtle attempts to influence royal decision-making. Several of Camilla's charitable commitments and public appearances over the past 6 months had been suggested by her handlers, steering her toward events and organizations that provided additional intelligence-gathering opportunities. They weren't just stealing information, Sarah realized aloud as she studied the timeline of manipulation. They were actively directing the Queen Consort's activities to maximize their access to sensitive, intelligence, and influential people. The financial investigation had traced the operation's funding through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that eventually led to what appeared to be a state-sponsored intelligence service. However, the sophisticated laundering techniques made it impossible to definitively identify which country was ultimately responsible for the operation. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on Camilla had been profound. Royal physicians reported that the Queen Consort had experienced significant stress-related health issues during the 3 months of blackmail, though she had concealed these symptoms from her family and staff. The manipulation had been so skillful that she had genuinely believed she was protecting the monarchy by cooperating with her blackmailers. The guilt and fear she experienced were carefully cultivated, Dr. Hartwell explained. The perpetrators understood that someone in her position would be more motivated by protecting others than by preserving her own reputation. They exploited her sense of duty and loyalty in ways that were both psychologically sophisticated and morally reprehensible. The technical analysis of the recovered surveillance equipment had revealed capabilities that exceeded what most intelligence agencies possessed. The devices could record conversations from distances of over 50 meters, photograph documents in low-light conditions with perfect clarity, and transmit encrypted data bursts that were nearly undetectable by conventional monitoring systems. Sarah found herself wondering how many other operations using similar techniques might be ongoing without detection. If the charity event intervention hadn't occurred, the blackmail scheme might have continued for years, gradually expanding to include other members of the royal family and eventually compromising the entire institution. The broader investigation had identified at least 12 other individuals in positions of influence who appeared to have been targeted by similar operations. These included a senior diplomat, 2 members of parliament, a military intelligence officer, and several prominent business leaders with government contracts. Not all of these potential targets had been successfully compromised, but the scope of the campaign was staggering. We're dealing with an adversary that has apparently unlimited resources and extremely sophisticated capabilities, Whitmore concluded grimly. This isn't the work of a criminal organization or even a typical intelligence service. The level of coordination and technical expertise suggests something more akin to a well-funded state program designed to systematically compromise Western institutions. The implications for royal security protocols were profound. Every aspect of protection procedures, communication systems, and venue security would need to be completely redesigned under the assumption that hostile intelligence services possessed detailed knowledge of current practices. The months of stolen information had provided the enemy with a comprehensive blueprint of how to defeat existing security measures. King Charles had been briefed on the full scope of the conspiracy, though the details of Camilla's involvement had been handled with extraordinary sensitivity. The king's reaction had been a mixture of concern for his wife's well-being and anger at those who had manipulated her. He had authorized whatever resources were necessary to ensure such a breach could never occur again. The investigation had also revealed the existence of what appeared to be sleeper agents who had been positioned within various organizations connected to royal functions. These individuals had maintained their cover identities for years, slowly building trust and access while waiting for activation orders that would allow them to support operations like the Camilla blackmail scheme. Sarah reflected on how different things might have been if her instincts hadn't warned her about the suspicious behavior at the charity event. The final data transfer that Victoria Sterling had attempted would have provided the blackmailers with real-time intelligence about royal security responses, potentially enabling future operations that could have been far more damaging. The counterintelligence teams were now working around the clock to identify and neutralize the broader network that had been revealed. However, the sophistication of the operation meant that many of the perpetrators had likely already disappeared, leaving behind only carefully constructed false identities and eliminated digital traces. The most troubling aspect, Dr. Hartwell observed, is that this represents a fundamental shift in how hostile intelligence services are operating. Instead of traditional espionage focused on military or diplomatic secrets, they're targeting the personal vulnerabilities of individuals in positions of influence, using psychological manipulation to turn them into unwilling assets. For Sarah, the investigation had been both professionally rewarding and personally troubling. She had successfully identified and disrupted a major threat to national security. But the experience had also revealed how vulnerable even the most protected individuals could be to sophisticated manipulation techniques. The Queen Consort had requested a private meeting with Sarah to personally express her gratitude for the intervention that had ended her months of torment. During their conversation, Camilla had described the relief she felt at finally being free from the constant fear and guilt that had dominated her life since the blackmail began. "I don't think I could have continued much longer," Camilla had confided. The stress of living a double life, of betraying Charles and the institution I had sworn to protect, was destroying me from the inside. You saved not just the Monarchy's security, but quite possibly my life as well. 6 months after the charity event incident, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews stood in the newly constructed Royal Security Operations Center, a state-of-the-art facility that had been built in direct response to the vulnerabilities exposed by the Camilla blackmail conspiracy. The center represented a complete revolution in how royal protection was conceptualized and implemented, incorporating lessons learned from one of the most sophisticated intelligence breaches in British history. The investigation had continued, to yield disturbing discoveries even months after Victoria Sterling and her associates had been taken into custody. Advanced forensic analysis of their equipment had revealed that the espionage operation had been active for over 5 years, with the Camilla blackmail representing only the most successful of multiple attempted infiltrations of royal circles. We now know that they made similar approaches to at least 6 other individuals with royal connections, explained Commander Patricia Wells, who had been appointed to head the new Royal Counterintelligence Division. Most of these attempts failed because the targets reported the suspicious contacts immediately. But the fact that so many approaches were made suggests a sustained campaign that we completely failed to detect. Sarah had been promoted and reassigned to serve as Deputy Director of the new division, a role that put her at the center of efforts to prevent future breaches while managing the ongoing fallout from the intelligence that had already been stolen. The months of stolen royal information continued to surface in unexpected ways, sometimes appearing in foreign intelligence reports or diplomatic cables that suggested ongoing exploitation of the compromised data. The psychological impact on the royal family had been profound and lasting. King Charles had become noticeably more cautious in his interactions with unfamiliar individuals, while other family members had been subjected to intensive security briefings about manipulation techniques and how to recognize potential intelligence approaches. The atmosphere of openness and accessibility that had characterized many royal functions had been replaced by a more guarded and suspicious environment. Queen Consort Camilla had undergone extensive counseling to address the trauma of her months-long ordeal, but she had also emerged as an unexpected asset in the counterintelligence effort. Her detailed debriefings had provided invaluable insights into how sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques were employed against high-value targets, leading to the development of new training programs for government officials and military leaders. The most important lesson we learned, Camilla had told a closed session of intelligence officials, is that no one is immune to these techniques. The perpetrators understood my weaknesses better than I understood them myself, and they exploited my desire to protect others in ways that made me betray everything I valued most. The international investigation had revealed that similar operations had been conducted against government officials and influential private citizens in over 20 countries. The coordination and resources involved suggested a systematic campaign designed to compromise Western institutions and decision-making processes on a scale that had never been previously imagined. Sarah often found herself reviewing intelligence reports that detailed how stolen royal information had been used to support other espionage operations around the world. Knowledge of royal security procedures had been applied to breaching protection systems for other world leaders, while compromised diplomatic communications had provided insights that influenced international negotiations and policy decisions. The technical capabilities revealed during the investigation had forced a complete re-evaluation of electronic security measures throughout the government. Traditional assumptions about secure communications and surveillance detection had proven inadequate against adversaries with access to equipment that exceeded the capabilities of most national intelligence services. We're essentially fighting an enemy that has better technology, more resources, and apparently unlimited patience, observed Dr. Michael Thornton, the Chief Technology Officer for the new security center. They're willing to spend years developing individual operations, and they have capabilities that we're still trying to understand and counter. The legal proceedings against Victoria Sterling and her associates had been conducted under extraordinary secrecy provisions that prevented most details from becoming public knowledge. However, the limited information that had been revealed suggested that all 3 defendants had extensive intelligence training and had operated under deep cover identities for many years, before being activated for the royal operation. Efforts to trace the ultimate source of the operation had been hampered by sophisticated cover techniques that made definitive attribution nearly impossible. However, the pattern of capabilities and methodologies suggested involvement by a major state intelligence service with resources that exceeded those available to most countries. The diplomatic implications had been carefully managed to avoid creating international incidents, but private communications with allied intelligence services had revealed that similar operations had been detected in multiple countries. The scope of the campaign suggested a coordinated effort to systematically compromise Western leadership and institutions. Sarah's new role required her to think about security threats in ways that went far beyond traditional protection concerns. Instead of simply preventing physical attacks or obvious espionage attempts, she now had to consider how psychological manipulation, social engineering, and long-term infiltration strategies might be used to compromise individuals in positions of trust and authority. The training programs developed in response to the investigation had been implemented across government departments, military services, and private companies with sensitive contracts. These programs focused on helping individuals recognize manipulation techniques, resist psychological pressure, and report suspicious contacts before they could develop into compromise situations. The most difficult aspect of this type of threat, Sarah explained to a group of newly trained security officers, is that the targets often don't realize they're being manipulated until it's too late. The perpetrators are skilled at making their requests seem reasonable, and their targets feel like willing participants rather than victims of coercion. The recovery of some stolen royal documents had provided insights into how the compromised intelligence was being processed and distributed. The information had been carefully categorized and cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources to create comprehensive profiles of British decision-making processes and institutional vulnerabilities. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some of the stolen intelligence had been used to identify additional targets for compromise. The detailed knowledge of royal social circles had enabled the perpetrators to map networks of influence and identify individuals who might provide access to other sensitive information or decision-making processes. The new security protocols implemented as a result of the investigation had fundamentally changed how the royal family operated. Every social interaction, charitable commitment, and public appearance now underwent extensive vetting to identify potential security risks or manipulation opportunities. The spontaneity and accessibility that had characterized many royal activities had been significantly reduced. King Charles had publicly supported the enhanced security measures while privately expressing regret about the impact on the monarchy's traditional relationship with the public. The balance between security and accessibility remained a constant challenge as the royal family adapted to operating in an environment where even charitable events could be vehicles for sophisticated intelligence operations. The ongoing investigation continued to yield new discoveries about the scope and sophistication of the espionage campaign. Each new piece of evidence reinforced the conclusion that the royal blackmail operation had been part of a much larger effort to systematically compromise Western institutions and leadership structures. For Sarah, the experience had been both professionally defining and personally transformative. She had successfully identified and disrupted one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in modern history, but the process had also revealed the extent of vulnerabilities that existed throughout British society and government. 1 year after the charity event that changed everything, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, now Deputy Director of Royal Counterintelligence, stood in the garden of Windsor Castle watching Queen Consort Camilla plant roses in memory of those whose lives had been affected by the espionage conspiracy. The ceremony was private and deeply personal, marking not just the anniversary of the incident, but also Camilla's journey from victim to advocate for intelligence security awareness. The final investigation report had been classified at the highest levels, but its conclusions had fundamentally altered British understanding of modern intelligence threats. The operation that had begun with blackmail photographs and ended with international espionage charges had revealed vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the royal family to encompass the entire structure of Western democratic institutions. "A year ago, I was living in constant fear," Camilla reflected as she carefully tended the memorial garden that had become her personal project. I felt isolated, ashamed, and convinced that I was protecting my family by betraying them. Today, I understand that I was as much a victim as anyone else affected by this conspiracy. The psychological manipulation techniques used against Camilla had become the subject of extensive academic study and professional training programs. Intelligence services around the world had requested access to the detailed debriefing materials, recognizing that the sophisticated methods employed represented a new evolution in espionage tactics that threatened traditional assumptions about security and loyalty. Sarah had been awarded the George Cross for her role in identifying and disrupting the operation, though the ceremony had been conducted in private to preserve the classified nature of her achievement. More meaningful to her had been the personal letter from King Charles expressing the royal family's gratitude for her courage and instincts in recognizing the threat when others had missed it. The broader investigation had ultimately identified a network of over 200 individuals across 43 countries who had been targeted by similar operations. Not all of these attempts had been successful, but the scope of the campaign had forced intelligence services worldwide to reconsider their understanding of how modern espionage was conducted. Victoria Sterling and her associates had been sentenced under special provisions of the Official Secrets Act that prevented details of their trials from becoming public knowledge. However, intelligence officials confirmed that all three defendants had extensive professional training and had been operating under deep cover identities for many years before being activated for specific operations. The technical capabilities revealed during the investigation had led to a complete overhaul of electronic security protocols throughout the British government. Traditional encryption methods and surveillance detection systems had proven inadequate against adversaries with access to equipment that exceeded the technological capabilities of most national intelligence services. The most important lesson we learned, Sarah told a closed gathering of international counterintelligence officials, is that the old model of espionage based on recruiting willing traitors has evolved into something much more sophisticated. Modern operations focus on manipulating unwilling victims into becoming sources of information while believing they're acting to protect the very institutions they're betraying. The recovery efforts for stolen royal intelligence had been largely successful, with most compromised documents and recordings being identified and contained before they could cause lasting diplomatic damage. However, some information had been incorporated into foreign intelligence assessments in ways that would influence international relations for years to come. The impact on royal family operations had been profound and lasting. Every aspect of royal life now operated under enhanced security protocols that assumed potential infiltration attempts at all levels of interaction. The openness and accessibility that had traditionally characterized the monarchy had been balanced against security requirements in ways that would have been unthinkable before the charity event incident. King Charles had established a new royal security foundation dedicated to advancing research into intelligence threats against democratic institutions. The foundation's work focused on developing better methods for detecting and countering sophisticated manipulation techniques while preserving the openness necessary for effective governance and public engagement. We cannot allow fear to fundamentally alter the nature of democratic institutions, the king had explained in his private address to intelligence officials. But neither can we ignore the reality that our traditional assumptions about security and loyalty have proven inadequate against adversaries with virtually unlimited resources and sophisticated capabilities. The international cooperation that had emerged from the investigation had led to unprecedented information sharing between allied intelligence services. The recognition that similar operations were being conducted worldwide had created a new framework for detecting and countering systematic campaigns against Western leadership and institutions. Sarah's new position had evolved to encompass not just royal security, but also the development of training and awareness programs for government officials, military leaders, and private sector executives who might be targeted by similar operations. The psychological techniques used against Camilla had proven applicable to a wide range of potential victims. The memorial garden had become a symbol of resilience and recovery for those affected by the conspiracy. Each rose represented a different aspect of the damage that had been caused and the healing that had followed. Camilla had chosen varieties that bloomed at different times throughout the year, ensuring that the garden would provide beauty and remembrance in every season. The hardest part of recovery, Camilla had explained to the counselors who now worked with other victims of intelligence manipulation, was learning to trust my own judgment again. When someone has manipulated your thoughts and emotions so skillfully, it becomes difficult to believe that any decision you make is truly your own. The academic institutions studying the case had identified the Camilla blackmail operation as a watershed moment in the evolution of intelligence warfare. The combination of psychological manipulation, technical sophistication, and international coordination represented a new model of espionage that threatened traditional concepts of national security and institutional protection. The ongoing monitoring systems established after the investigation continued to detect attempted infiltrations and manipulation campaigns targeting various levels of British society. Most of these attempts were less sophisticated than the royal operation, but their frequency suggested that the threat had become a permanent feature of the modern security environment. Sarah often reflected on how a routine charity event had uncovered one of the most significant intelligence threats in modern British history. Her decision to trust her instincts and act on suspicious observations had prevented what could have been years of continued compromise and institutional damage. The final legacy of the investigation was a fundamental shift in how Western societies approach the protection of democratic institutions and leaders. The recognition that psychological manipulation could be as dangerous as traditional espionage had led to new training programs, security protocols, and international cooperation frameworks designed to preserve the openness of democratic societies while defending against sophisticated adversaries. As Camilla finished planting the last rose in the memorial garden, she turned to Sarah with a smile that reflected both the pain of the experience and the strength that had emerged from surviving it. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing what others missed and having the courage to act on what you saw. You saved not just my life, but quite possibly the institution we all serve." The garden would bloom for generations to come, a living reminder that even the most sophisticated threats could be defeated by individuals willing to trust their instincts and act with courage when facing the unknown. The roses would tell a story of betrayal and recovery, of vulnerability and strength, and of the price of freedom in an age of unprecedented threats to democratic institutions. Sarah knew that the work was far from over. New threats would emerge, and new methods of protection would be needed to counter them. But the investigation had proven that dedicated professionals with adequate resources and international cooperation could successfully defend against even the most sophisticated adversaries. The memorial garden stood as testament to both the damage that could be done and the healing that was possible when people chose to stand together against those who would exploit their weaknesses and vulnerabilities.